In this video I want to talk about a painting done by Rembrandt van Rijn in 1648. That was 6 years after he made his most famous work, The Night Watch. The painting I'm talking about is The Visitors of Emmaus, and it hangs in the Louvre in Paris. The Visitors of Emmaus is a story in the Bible which Rembrandt has painted several times. He also made some etchings about this story. Let's talk a little about the story itself. After the crucifixion of Christ, 2 disciples were headed to the village of Emmaus when they met a stranger who accompanied them. It was Christ himself, but they didn't recognize him. This is a passage from the Bible, and this is from the King James version of the Bible. It's Luke 24. And they drew nigh unto the village whither they went, and he made as though he would have gone further. But they constrained him, saying, Abide with us, for it is toward evening, and the day is far spent. And he went in to tarry with them. And it came to pass, as he sat at meat with them, he took bread, and blessed it, and brake, and gave to them. And their eyes were opened, and they knew him, and he vanished out of their sight. So that's the story that Rembrandt must have read in his version of the Bible in the 17th century. Rembrandt was not the first painter to paint this story. And Rembrandt's version of the story, Rembrandt's painting, is not totally original. I want to show you 2 paintings done by Caravaggio, 2 versions of this story. And these were made prior to Rembrandt's version, at the beginning of the 17th century. Rembrandt could have known these paintings looking at engravings made after Caravaggio's work. Rembrandt himself didn't leave the Netherlands, as far as we know. He didn't travel to Italy, and he probably did not see these paintings in real life, as far as we know. But the paintings of Caravaggio were so famous in the 17th century already that he was very influential throughout the 17th century, and there were engravings. So Rembrandt could have known Caravaggio's work. The painting by Rembrandt hanging in the Louvre depicting this passage seemed to be based on a model that was provided by Caravaggio, his 2 paintings. And here we can compare them side by side. It's interesting to look at Caravaggio's 2 versions because they are very different from each other. The painting on the left was painted first, around 1601, and it hangs in the National Gallery in London. The second version, the one on the right, hangs in Milan, in the Brera Art Gallery, and it was made in 1606. Caravaggio shows in both paintings how Christ raises his hand to bless the bread. The first version shows the disciples responding to this with very much action. It's a very explosive and dramatic scene. The second version shows them much more constrained. For some reason, the version on the right always had much more appeal to me, although both versions are great paintings. But it's like a much older and much matured painter painted the later one, although it was only made 5 years later. Caravaggio, in turn, because the story goes on, seems to have based his first version on The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. When we compare the midsection of The Last Supper by da Vinci with the first Visitors of Emmaus by Caravaggio, we can clearly see that the disciple on the right has a posture which resembles the disciple spreading his arm on the right of the figure of Christ in The Last Supper by da Vinci. The figure of Christ in Caravaggio's painting seems to be inspired by the depiction of Christ on Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel. The way Christ raises his hands has certain similarities in both works of art. Rembrandt painted Christ breaking the bread instead of blessing it. If we assume that Christ has just blessed it before breaking the bread, then we don't see the immediate responses of the disciples recognizing Christ, unlike the versions by Caravaggio. In the Bible passage, Christ vanishes out of his disciples their sight. In Rembrandt's painting he did not vanish out of their sight yet. Rembrandt painted the figure of Christ very solid, but his expression and posture seemed to make him otherworldly. Rembrandt painted a halo around him, or a certain shine, which makes him seem of a holy or supernatural nature. The responses of the disciples are constrained. They are similar to the responses of the disciples on the second version of this theme by Caravaggio. The servant does not seem to know what is actually happening, and he appears unmoved by Christ breaking the bread. On the lower left we see a dog resting. This detail adds to the impression of a modest and rustic scene in which the story unfolds. It's the total opposite of the explosive scene in Caravaggio's first version. Let's take a look at the architecture that Rembrandt has painted. It seems like a temple or a church rather than a modest place where people can eat and stay for the night. The placement of the table and the figures and the design of the architecture adds to the solemn character of this piece. Visually, Christ seems to sit at the center of a sort of chapel-like space, which enhances the impression we get of him by his halo, his shine, his expression. The paintings by Caravaggio are built around the figures. He didn't even paint any architectural elements. When we look at Rembrandt's version, we see an architectural construction in which the figures are carefully placed. The architecture adds to the character of the piece in an important way. The scene in which the story unfolds only takes 1/3 of the overall composition. Carefully, Rembrandt builds up the tonal values to the white of the tablecloth. The center of attention becomes the area where we see the hands of Christ breaking the bread. We see one area, the tablecloth, as the lightest detail in the painting. There is a hierarchy in lighted areas. This is related to the importance of each area. The figure of Christ receives most light. His face is lighter than the faces of the other figures. His clothes are lighter too. His figure especially catches the eye. Other supporting motifs, which are fundamental to the story, like supporting actors, are those of the disciples. They receive less light than the most important figure of Christ, but still enough. The dog, for example, is not really part of the story, though his presence adds to the scene in general. It is lying in the shadows. One won't see it until the eye wanders around through the painting and stumbles upon it. The shadows and lighted areas are carefully distributed. Rembrandt avoided the chessboard-like appearance in which light and dark areas create harsh contrasts. The shadows give the eye of the viewer places to rest in the composition. The lighted areas are carefully placed next to each other. They form larger areas as well and a satisfying viewing experience. In general, one can say that the lights and the shadows are carefully grouped together to create a satisfying viewing experience, with places to rest for the eye. The outline of the figure of Christ is uninterrupted. One often sees in 17th century paintings that the outline of the main figure or the main motif is uninterrupted. Rembrandt pupil Samuel van Hoogstraten, in his book about painting, recommends this to get a satisfying viewing experience. When we come to a conclusion, we can say that The Visitors of Emmaus is such a scene which can be interpreted as an explosive scene, or totally the opposite. In Caravaggio's two versions, we see both options. The effect Rembrandt was looking for is not the outward drama which makes this scene meaningful. It's what happens in silence, in muted fashion, in the hearts and minds of the disciples, and those who are affected by a great work of art.